Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you very much for watching or listening. Liam Hartree here today with another episode of Presenting Champions for the Simply Inspired podcast. And I've got to say, I'm truly honored, blessed, and humbled to be joined by a very, very special guest today. Today's guest needs no introduction from me, but I'm going to give one anyway. Nate Marquardt today is joining the show, UFC veteran, UFC title challenger, Strikeforce champion, king of Pancrase, has shared a cage with some of the best names that you can share a cage with, including Anderson Silva, Damian Mayer, Chael Sonnen, Jeremy Horn, Tyron Woodley, CB Dollaway, Kevin Gastelman, Vito Belfort. I mean, the list goes on and on, quite a few more than that. Nearly 60 MMA fights. An absolute legend of the game. And as well as that, as always with my podcast, we're not just going to be talking about fighting, but we're going to be talking about Nate's life outside the cage as well, and I get a little bit of inspiration and positivity. So, champ, that's enough of me talking about you in third person. I just wanted to give a few highlights there. As I mentioned, thank you so much for coming on the show, and it's a pleasure and an honor.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No worries at all, no problem. So, one of the things that I'm going to get into, starting with not really the beginning, but starting with actually recent times. Obviously, you were out of the game for several years, for nearly 4 years. You came back in 2021, had a little run there with Titan FC. So I'd like to mention what the inspiration was at that time, given everything you've accomplished, given the dizzy heights that you've reached. As I understand it, there's an interesting story about what inspired you to actually come back at that time.
Definitely. Yeah. Excuse me. So it's kind of a long story, but essentially I came back because God, has me on this path to, I believe it's, he has me in MMA because I have influence here so I don't exactly know what his plan is at this point. I'm still training and I'm still open to take a fight this year, but I would say this year is probably about the last that you know, as far as I know, that I would be able to take a fight. And if something happens this year, I'm open to it. Like if I get a good offer or something. But regardless, I am, I'm in the gym and I do Bible studies at Killcliff FC. Looking at starting another one at Fight Sports in Deerfield, and basically doing ministry with fighters and through mixed martial arts. Recently, I went on a mission trip to Germany and Armenia with it's called FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which over here it's a decent size organization. It's fairly well known. It's in a lot of high school sports, basketball, football, wrestling. And so the wrestling side of FCA called me up, and they were doing a seminar over in Germany, and they also have a really cool ministry that they're partnering with now. That's an FCA ministry. It's called Fight Life, and it's in Armenia, and so they wanted me there for that portion of it. And so actually the guy who started the gym there, he'll be at my house in like a week from Armenia. So it's pretty exciting stuff that's going on right now through that side of things.
Absolutely. I'm glad we got to give that a mention because it was something that I had here to cover with you actually, because with that, is that where you see your life going in terms of your primary focus? As you mentioned just now, this year likely to be the last year that you actually compete and everything. And obviously soon we'll go back in time and we'll talk about some of your achievements. But I'm actually starting with going forward. I've seen one or two interviews where you mentioned this. Do you think that the ministry and that area of your life is going to become your primary focus? I mean, I know it's a big focus now, you know what I mean, but even beyond training and everything, if you get what I mean with this one.
You mean like ministry itself?
Yeah, ministry itself, and basically
Yeah.
helping people, touching lives. I know you're already doing a lot of that. And do you see that side of your work? When I say your work, God's work, really, but do you see that side
Yeah.
of that growing as the years go on from here?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, honestly, that's the only reason I'm training is because I strongly believe that God led me this way. And, he had to do some pretty crazy stuff to convince me of that. So, uh, yeah, I mean, I went to seminary in from 2017. I graduated 2020, and initially I was gonna just go do international missions, but God called me back to mixed martial arts, and so that was I started seeing it more as my mission field. So rather than international missions being like you go to a people group and you minister to those people, it is international missions because it's cross cultural, but it's also my mission field is mixed martial artists, and through the platform of mixed martial arts, everyone associated with mixed martial arts, whether it's the fans, the coaches, or the athletes. And so, yeah, I mean, fighting is for me is has been secondary. I mean, really, since I got saved, to be honest. But now, especially, it's secondary to any kind of ministry that I'm doing. Which I've, you know, my family always. I have to minister to them first. That's my first ministry, and so I put them first, and then after my wife and my kids, then it's the mission field. So
Absolutely. I love that. So much respect for giving back, contributing to people's lives, being a positive role model, a positive influence, given your stature in the sport of MMA. I'm aware, obviously, how important your faith is to you. I'm not necessarily aware of the timeline of when you mentioned when you were saved,
mm,
actually, because as I've mentioned, I respect that you stand for your beliefs so much, by the way, because in the world that we live in today, well, you know what they say, if you don't stand for something, you fall for anything. So at the end
mm.
of the day, the fact that you stand for who you are, whether people agree with it or not, I mean, the fact that you stand for who you are is, I've got a lot of respect for that. So just before we get into the fighting side of things as well, at what point were you saved? Has your faith always been very important to you, or was there a particular, from the sound of it, there was a particular experience that you had that really pointed you in that direction and opened your eyes, so to speak?
For sure. I mean, I grew up as a Christian, like in a Christian home, but I really fell away, and so it was, through success and successive events that um really brought me back, and so I would say I was actually saved in 2013. Um, before then it was kind of, my faith was important to me, but it was like a secondary issue. It was me first, and then I had Jesus on the side. I wanted salvation. I believed in all of the moral issues, things like that. So I knew and I believed it was true, but I really hadn't fully surrendered my life. I hadn't really put my trust in the Lord, and I hadn't repented of sin. So like I was still, even though there were some things, like when I got married, I kind of knew that I was living the wrong way. So when I got married, I tried to stay on track, but it was in my own strength. I don't believe I had the power of the Holy Spirit. And because now that I do, it's night and day. I'm not doing it in my strength. I'm doing it in God's strength. And, the things that I desired, I don't desire them anymore. So it's not even an issue for a lot of the things. And yeah, so So that was 2013 that where I believe I really got saved.
Remarkable. I mean, it's a remarkable transformation, as you've mentioned, in terms of your perspective and in terms of your priorities. And there's so many things. And when I do these interviews, as I mentioned in the intro, it's not just about the combat side of things. I'm always trying to give people inspiration, hope, positivity, life lessons, and things of that nature through stories from people who've achieved great things as you have. So very grateful for you mentioning that. That was the reason for starting there. When we look back at obviously MMA and what you're known for and everything, you have a different worldview on it now than you had before by the sound of it. Um, but I would like to talk about some of your favorite moments as a fighter. I'm sure by the sound of it, some of them have been eclipsed now by the life you now live and what you now experience. But nonetheless, you have a lot to be proud of. You've always represented the sport very well. So because we won't have time to talk about every single fight as much as I'd love to, I'd like to just, in your own words, for you to describe a few of your personal favorite moments of your career? I know this is a big question in nearly 60 fights, but I love asking this question because the answers can often be not what a person expects. So in your own words, what are your personal highlights from your career?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think probably my answers would probably be expected because for sure some of the highlights are when I won the championships, whether it was Strikeforce, that was possibly my best fight ever and excellent, one of my best finishes, probably the best finish I've had, and top level opponent who was undefeated at the time for a world title. And yeah, I mean it was a lot of fun, a lot of hard work that paid off. And yeah, I think that would probably be one of the top. And then the first time I won the Pancrase title was another really big one. I was 20 years old, still just really a kid. And same, I worked very hard and I had a lot of stuff going on in my life at that point. Um, I just had my oldest daughter, and for that fight, I had stayed in Japan for 4 months to train for it. So I mean, a lot of emotion going into that fight, and then I was on top of it. I was the sickest I've ever been in my entire life. I think I was sick for like 3 or 4 months after the fight, um, and I had some kind of virus where, yeah, just totally made me so tired and just felt horrible. But I pushed through and was able to win, and yeah, I mean that really set my career on a path. If I hadn't won that fight, I'd be in a totally different situation, but just because that opened up so many doors for me. And so yeah, I mean for me it's easy to see that even though I wasn't really following the Lord that like I should back then, that God was always with me and he was always guiding me and giving me favor in places I didn't deserve it. So even though I worked hard, I know so many people that work hard and they've just never had those opportunities. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I get where you're coming from. When you look back on some of these experiences, obviously they make more sense in hindsight, in retrospect, than they did actually at the time. And I totally get where you're coming from there. So the fact you were so ill with that fight, you were so unwell, do you class that as one of your toughest fights then, given the fact that you had to push through that situation? Or do you feel that there are others? I mean, you've had a career of fights that would be regarded as tough. You fought the best. So again, in terms of highlights, I'd be curious because, as well as that, because tough fights are obviously that's a subjective thing. I mean, people think of like, oh, power or whatever, but often it's something going on outside the cage, or it's not what people think it is. So, would you say that Strikeforce one was your toughest, or one of your toughest, or are there others that come to mind for that topic?
yeah, well, the one I was extremely sick or ill, that was for the Pancrase title, the first time I
Right.
won it back in 2020. So For sure, because I actually had 2 fights on that night as well. So it was one of them for sure. I would say it probably was the hardest fight I ever had. Both of them, especially the second one. The second one went to overtime as well. So it was if I remember correctly, they were 15-minute fights, no rounds, just one round, 15 minutes. And the first fight I won, it went to decision, so I fought 15 minutes, and then the second one was another 15 minutes, and then I think it was a 5-minute overtime, and I won in overtime. So that was very difficult, very hard on the body. I mean, I felt like I was gonna die, and I just almost was like willing to. I was like, just push through, saying, "Okay, if I die, I die." 'Cause I just, yeah. And I had one other tournament. Actually, I fought 3 fights in one night, and that was the tournament that I won. It was called the Boss Root Invitational. That was what got me that opened the door, so I was able to fight in Japan. And that one was tough as well. I wasn't sick, but just 3 fights, and my first fight, my hand blew up like a balloon. The knuckle, I don't know if I fractured something or how I injured it, but it blew up. Kind of looked like when you blow into a surgical glove, and that was what my hand looked like. And I that was after the first fight, and then I had to fight 2 more fights. So that was painful and grueling. My last fight in that tournament was all the fights were no time limit. So the first 2 fights I was able to finish them within maybe 5 minutes, but the last one went 15 minutes or around there, and so it was a tough mental challenge and physical challenge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Remarkable.
I remember another one that where just pain wise, I fought Wilson Govea, and I was throwing some leg kicks, and one of them he checked, and it hit just on the outside of my bone, along the muscle, and it basically deadened the nerve. I remember I went to step back, and my foot felt like it was floppy, and I almost rolled my ankle. So I was like, "Oh no, I can't feel my foot." And also, well, I couldn't like move my foot, but I felt it because the pain was excruciating. And I just remember for like a minute of the fight, all I could think about was the pain. And so I was trying to move around and pretend that I wasn't hurt. And and then eventually, the pain went away. But man, that was tough too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Wow.
remember getting hit in the body once. A guy named Kazuo Misaki. He's a very tough fighter. He actually has a win over Dan Henderson in Pride, and I was rematching him. The first time I fought him, I did a belly to belly throw, and he put his arm out, and his arm got kind of snapped underneath us. And then so we rematched. It went to a decision, and one of the rounds he hit me in the body, and same thing. It's just like all you can think about, but you try to pretend you're not as hurt as you are. Um, yeah, so for sure, I'm sure a lot of fighters have stories like that where you're hurt and you have to play it off as if you're not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You have to not show it and to some extent lean into it. I get where you're coming from. Something you've touched on here, I think is fascinating, something I wanted to discuss with you. Obviously, you've been in the sport for such a long time and you've seen a lot of changes. I mean, when you're talking about these formats and how it was. I mean, let's put it this way, you've been a fighter nearly as long as I've actually been alive, even, so let's put it that way. So you will have been through all seasons and seen changes, good and bad, I'd imagine, from the early days. So I know this is quite a sweeping question because there's different avenues we can go down with this, but just in your personal opinion, maybe one or two things that you like about how the sport has changed, maybe one or two things you don't. Again, I know this is a big question, but I just thought that you're in a unique perspective, I've had a few guys on this show actually who've been, including Jeremy Horn, who you fought, and a few guys who've been into MMA since it was legal or even slightly before. And I've asked them this question. But yeah, just to get your thoughts on the sport as a whole and how it's developed in your many years of involvement.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, when I first started, it was there were no time limits, no. I'm trying to think. I never fought no gloves, but I remember when I first started training, they were still having fights with no gloves, and uh, so I mean that was a big change once they added the rounds. Really changed the style and the objective of the fight. It I didn't like it at first because I was a submission guy and always looking for the finish, and then it seemed like if I lost, it would be decision because someone was able to take me down and hold me. But I've eventually kind of I like it now. I like the rules for the most part. Um, I think there's a problem with the scoring. To be honest, I think uh, there's something wrong when there's a round that's even and you have to choose one. To me, that doesn't seem right because then you could have two rounds that are even, and then the third round somebody dominates, and you look at the fight and you say, well, that guy won, but actually maybe you chose the other two guys or the other two rounds for the other guy, and I think you can get some bad decisions that way. So I mean, yeah, I think that would be something that needs to be looked at is the scoring. And um yeah, I mean, I don't know, of course. I'm sure you heard about my recent tweet. So of course that's something I don't appreciate is when the UFC or whoever it is, UFC or ESPN or whatever, uses our sport as an agenda, like to push an agenda. Um, and yeah, I mean, of course, there's all kinds of things that surround sports, alcoholism and, sex sells kind of idea, those things. And I don't like that. I don't, but there's, that's one thing. And there's another thing when an agenda is being pushed on us, to say that something's okay. And yeah, I mean, it's similar with, whatever the sin is, if they're trying to push it and make it sound like it's okay, I'm against it. And so I'm against, a commercial of two men kissing just as much as I'm against the commercial of, they were saying it's okay to cheat on your wife or sleep with your girlfriend. So personally, that's, I mean, it's not personally, that's biblically, those things are wrong and we shouldn't accept them or endorse them. But of course, our cult, the culture of this world is all about that stuff, and that's where we are. But as Christians, I believe we should stand up against it. Meaning, to say that it's wrong. I think it would be unloving to tell someone that something is good or not wrong, which literally causes problems in society. It causes problems in the family, causes health problems, all kinds of things, right? You think of fornication, you have disease, you have children out of wedlock, you have all kinds of problems. And homosexuality, same thing. You have all kinds of society problems. Um, and, it just, like I said, it would be unloving to not say something about it.
So you stand up for your beliefs, as I mentioned earlier, and I respect standing up for your beliefs, whether people personally agree or not. As I mentioned, the fact that you stand um, for your truth, really, and God's truth, I respect that because these days people don't do it. These days people sort of bend to the will of the media, of what I would regard, this sort of cancel culture type of idea, if you don't agree with the popular narrative, people will effectively cancel you out from things. You've
Mhm.
stood up for this, there was obviously some backlash and what have you. Has there been much support as well from the Christian community and everything, or has it mostly been how do I put this into words? Basically, people have spun it, that everyone is sort of on your case about saying this, but I'd imagine there's just as many people with you and as there are against you. Is that accurate, or am I sort of off track with taking a stab at that one? Have you had much support, basically, as well as the hatred, unfortunately?
I I would say that to looking at it, I'd say there are kind of four categories of people. Of course, you have the haters who immediately, they're not even following me in the first place, but then they get wind of it and they just send their hate my way. So, uh, and those are the same people that are pushing that agenda. So you have that. There's at least four categories. Yeah. So you have that. You also have Christians who have kind of bought into that narrative, like that saying somebody is wrong or that something that people do is wrong is unloving, which that doesn't make sense. And that's not biblical either. So you have, I had several Christians who reached out to me. But I also had, so most of those were public, like people tweeting me or sending stuff on Instagram. But privately, I had a ton of Christian supporters, some publicly as well. And there's a fourth group, well, maybe a fifth group. I think there are some maybe friends that I have who disagree with me, but they didn't really say either way. But then but anyway, the fourth group is there was a massive amount of Russians and Ukrainians and Dagestanis and Chechens and most of them Muslim that reached out to me and they said, "Hey, we love you. You're a hero over here. Please come to our country." Like just so much support, which is funny because, like I said, you on the other side you have a lot of Christians that were against what I said. They say, "Well, it's not a. I wouldn't have said it that way," or kind of arguing with how I worded it or something like that. And but yeah, so it it opened a door for me to be a light to people in those countries, the Russians and people in that area. I guess some I think it was a Russian news outlet that posted it somewhere, and so they started reaching out to me on Instagram, which I didn't. It was a tweet, right? So, uh, and yeah, right. Currently, my public my page, my Facebook page is I can't get into it, and so yeah, I don't I don't know what to do about that. But I don't know if that's because of something similar or because it did. I posted something about Dana White with the slap incident, and nothing. I wasn't like condemning him or anything, but uh, I was actually saying I did a similar thing when I was younger and I went to jail, and then I just from that I used that to tell the gospel. But it was after that, like a week later, my account, I couldn't get into it. And now it's saying it's been deactivated or something. So I don't know. It's funny. Like you said, cancel culture. So maybe Dana White canceled me.
Well, you never know, but nonetheless, I mean, one of the things that I do respect a great deal about you as an individual is the fact that when you're putting these things out there trying to guide people, you're not claiming to be perfect either, because that's always the thing that when people put these types of comments out there as if they're coming from a very righteous place in that sense. But like you said about the Dana White thing, you did something like that when you were younger, you're open about it. It's not really a question. I'm just saying to you that the fact that you share what you've learned from your positive and negative experiences in life, that makes it sort of understandable for people where you're coming from. Yeah, I mean, the whole propaganda thing. Personally, I have a problem with people forcing people to think a certain way, which is why I mentioned it, the cancel culture,
Hmm.
regardless of people's different beliefs, people have different beliefs about different things, which I respect, people coming from different points of view, but I don't respect people forcing other people, like what you said about the propaganda aspect of how sports being used. Um, not keen on that. So it's an interesting topic. It's a very multifaceted topic, and I feel that we could be here all day talking about it. But it
Yeah.
was good to get your side of what was going on because yeah, when I was researching for this, man, I was watching back some of your fights and getting a few things ready, but everywhere it was just this tweet, and the tweet thing was just every article. I was like, oh, I've got to cut through this to get to the fight stuff. So you know um yeah, cancel culture is a strange one. Absolutely. But you're obviously going to continue standing for your beliefs. How are you going to continue to put yourself out there if social media shuts people down, like you've been deactivated, or will you just make new accounts and continue that way? Or how are you going to find a workaround? I know it's a strange question, but it's a big issue now where people do get shut down, like there's been a few recent examples with like Andrew Tate.
Hmm.
Whether people love him, whether people hate him. I don't want to get into that because it's a different people's opinions, but they do shut people down like this. And in many cases, as in his case, it actually brings more exposure, more publicity. It puts the spotlight on that person more for whatever they're saying. Do you feel that that is actually been the case for yourself? It's actually not so much raised your profile because you have a big profile, but it's put you back in the public eye maybe more than you were even a few months ago, type of thing.
I mean, sure, it did temporarily, but at the same time, I think you kind of asked, what I would do if I basically if I got canceled, and
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, my I've never been a big social media guy anyway, so I can't do anything that God doesn't want me to do. If God wants me to have a big social media influence, then I will, and they won't be able to do anything to stop it, to be honest. And um, but regardless, I'm just moving forward in the direction that He has me going, and yeah, I just kind of leave that up to Him. And I'm not worried about it. I think that's partly why I'm not scared of getting shut down, and that's why I think a lot of people that reach out to me privately, they believe the same way, but they wouldn't post it publicly because they're afraid themselves of getting canceled. Uh, and that's what they do too. Like if you agree with them, they'll start attacking you on social media as well. I had something happen with a friend, a good friend, where that was happening to him and anyone online that agreed with him. They were like calling their jobs and all kinds of crazy stuff. So,
Mm.
but yeah, I'm just not. I'm not scared. I'm not. I've always kind of been that way. Just gonna speak my mind, and if it offends someone, I'm not. That's not my intention. Um, especially now, it's not my intention specifically to offend them. I know that the truth is offensive when you believe a lie and you because deep down they know that there's something wrong with that lifestyle. And again, I'm not just trying to pick on, homosexuality. That's any sin. So when I say that, fornication is wrong, I'm sure a lot of people don't like to hear that either. Uh, but that's what I said. So when you say something that's true, it's going to offend people, and that's why the Bible says that we're supposed to speak the truth in love. Like ultimately, we want to point them to Jesus, and that's the goal. But
That's
it's hard sometimes on Twitter with how what do you get 70 characters or whatever it is.
yeah.
It's hard to have a conversation of any depth on
Mm.
Twitter. So
It is, and it's something about social media. Obviously, social media has its positive side where people can get certain ideas out there, people can connect around the world. I've got nothing with technology. I mean, it's amazing, even the fact we can talk like this, thousands of miles away. But the thing is, there is a lack of debate on social media about any topic now. There seems to be a sort of culture of people becoming very emotionally incited and what have you, and not looking to have any sort of logical because as I mentioned to you before, people having different points of view about things. I mean, that's part of life. But the fact that people can't come together and say, okay, where are you coming from? And this is where I'm coming from, or whatever. Even if you had somebody on social media who totally was against everything you're saying, and it was that extreme, it would still be okay if they were willing to have like put their point across and you put your point across, even if at the end you agree to disagree, maybe you agree to actually agree, and you come to a conclusion. But there's not really that. There's just like, if people don't think one way, they get attacked, and it's a very strange thing about our culture. Anyway, let's not go on a tangent with this. I'm glad we got to give that a mention. Um, Coming back to a couple more MMA topics. One of the things that I've mentioned with this is you're an individual who's very true to yourself. You're very true to what you believe. You're very true to your principles. Um, I know you're saying, these are the principles of the Bible, these are the principles of God, but you've taken them on, so you remain true to them. So that leads me in an abstract sort of connection to when you started MMA. I'm not saying it's connected to your faith. But in your era, obviously, it wasn't like it is now. It wasn't $1 billion industry. It wasn't all over the TV. Being a UFC champion wasn't necessarily as much of a clear path, whereas now people can grow up from an early age wanting to be like a UFC champion and training for it. So when it comes to your initial motivations to get into a sport that was quite niche at the time, and maybe at the time you had people saying, "What are you doing?" In the same type of thing as you do now. I don't know. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about those early years and what your motivation was in the very beginning.
Well, I mean, like I said, I got into it because I watched the first couple UFCs, and I mean, I saw Hoist Gracie defeat Dan Severn, guy almost twice his size, and I was small in high school, so I mean, that was kind of my goal from the start. Was I wanted to be a champion, I wanted to be UFC champion, and yeah, I mean, that was I always loved wrestling and boxing and karate, and I loved kung fu movies and everything combat, hand to hand combat, or like sword fighting or whatever, any kind of combat really that was physical. I always liked that as a kid. So yeah.
Absolutely, that was it. Okay, that's cool. And at the time, though, what was was it makes sense? I mean, it makes total sense. The inspiration. So at the time, though, what was the I say the public response? I mean, in terms of like the response of, say, your community or your
Oh,
friends.
yeah, you're saying, okay, that's right. You asked
Oh, no, that's cool.
how
Just
what people would say and
yeah,
what was their response
yeah,
to me doing that, right? To me fighting or
absolutely.
training.
In the beginning, when as the reason I ask is, sorry to cut in just for a moment, but
Yeah.
with the inspiration of why you're doing it, so it makes total sense. But the I had a guy on the show a while back called Travis View, who has been fighting since well, the early days and everything. And what made me think of it is, at the time he said, I think he might have been even a little bit earlier even than yourself getting into MMA. But anyway, at the time, he said that people said to him, like, "What are you doing? This cage fighting thing. What is it?" And there was
Yeah.
some support, and there was some not from a negative point of view or anything like that. I don't like to dwell on anything negative, but I'm just curious, like, what people's perception of it was then versus now. Obviously, it's like, yeah, you're getting into MMA, great. We all know there's the safety in place. We all know there's the money. There's at least at the higher levels, there's the career path. But at that time, it wasn't like that. So yeah, what
Mhm.
was people's response really?
Yeah, I mean, it was. Well, for me, I remember a lot of the response was kind of like, uh, it was probably pretty funny because I, I mean, when I graduated high school, I was 135 pounds, and saying, I'm going to be a professional fighter, probably, and like at that time there were no weight classes, and that was my plan. It was like, I don't care about weight classes. Uh, so yeah, I'm. It was probably funny to a lot of people, and they're, very doubtful that it was going to happen or that I would be successful. And then once I started, and then when I was fighting in Japan, I had put a little weight on. Well, that was by the time I was 20, so I was 155 at that point, and uh, so I think though I'd kind of made it far enough where they saw that I was successful. I think I already had around 11 fights at that time, and uh, but yeah, I mean, it was a lot. I would say a lot of people didn't know what it was, uh, and if they did know what it was, their thought was more back when the UFC first started, and there were virtually no rules except no biting or eye gouging, and so they either kind of thought it was crazy or they had no clue. And yeah, I mean, I remember throughout my career, people would just kind of look at me and be like, "Do you make any money doing that?" Or and ask you, "Oh yeah, how much money do you make doing that?" I don't know. Yeah, it seemed like uh, probably half and half. There'd be negative response or positive, and just depends on their understanding of mixed martial arts, probably.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes total sense. And obviously now the knowledge is there, whether people follow
Hmm.
it or not, they don't, it's obviously totally mainstream. But I was just fascinated by that time and people's perceptions. So very cool. Okay.
Hmm.
Obviously, I'm mindful of your time and you've got things to do with your day. So we'll move into the what I'll say is the latter phase of this with a few more topics just to let you know that, and for people's attention spans as well.
Hmm.
Obviously, you competed for a long time, and you competed at a very, very high level for a long time as well. And this is something that I feel is would be interesting to get into in terms of the physical strength and the physical skill that it takes, but the mental and emotional strength. Now, I know that you said earlier, since you were saved, obviously your strength is coming from God, and it's not your own strength. But just focusing on your own strength just for a moment. Um, Staying consistent at a high level for so many years, I think, is an incredible feat. I think it takes incredible inner strength as I mentioned, physical strength to do. So, how did you basically keep yourself driven, motivated, committed, all of that type of thing, to such a tough sport for so many years? Obviously, you enjoy it. Obviously, you're using it as a platform to reach people as well. So there are certain things that we've touched on, but just going a little bit deeper into that, if you don't mind, please, in terms of the consistency, because I feel that it's something people almost they don't overlook, but they think they obviously know you've achieved all these things, but they think, oh yeah, you've achieved all these things. Let's hone in on certain fights. Whereas I'm thinking of it of the point of view of consistently staying at the highest level. What would you personally attribute that to, aside from your faith, which we've mentioned in terms of your lifestyle and your mental and emotional strength, if you get where I'm coming from with this question.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, ultimately, like you said, I believe it's all God's doing, and but I think that He did that, a lot of it, through giving me wisdom on how to train, and how to compete. So and the older I get and the more I see, that's where I would say I'm just now coming to this realization recently, is that wow, God really set me up in the beginning of my career. I could have trained anywhere, or I could have, I could have trained with all different kinds of styles, but I went to these specific places that formed my idea of how to train. And now that I've seen more, and I'm able to compare the way so many other people train, I see that God gave me a lot of wisdom.
Mm.
And especially for me, I started when I was 16, and guys have the advantage now. They can start from, oh, even back then, there were kids who wrestled since they were 5, but I didn't have that. But what I did have was God guiding me to, like I said, I believe he gave me wisdom on the best ways to train. And yeah, I see. Oh, thank you. There's yeah, um so what that means practically looks like, take sparring for example. I've trained with kickboxing, kickboxers, professional boxers, amateur boxers, karate fighters, full contact karate fighters, Muay Thai, and I see all different kinds of styles of training. For example, like with boxing, a lot of the boxers I sparred with, it was just one step under an actual fight. So like they might hit someone knowing that it would knock them out, but if you rock someone, then in a sparring situation they might pull back, whereas in a fight they might go to finish. But they might try to rock you. In other words, they might try to ring your bell so hard that you can't stand. And that's I trained that way for a while, and I kind of saw the effects that can have on your body, on your mind, your brain, basically. And I think that from an early age, I was sparring to really take care to use full speed but not full power on the punches and kicks, and really try to take care of your training partner. And so that was kind of instilled in me. And so it was really hard for me to go with guys. They might try to knock me out, but if I had a chance to knock them out, I wouldn't. It's like I would pull my punch just a little bit. Like I might hit them hard, but and I feel like that's actually the right way to train. I don't think you need to be getting knocked out in the gym or trying to knock your opponent out, your training partner out in the gym. I think you can get a lot more miles and a lot more um, work. You can get a lot more experience if you train smart. So I think there might be a time for that in spots, but if you're doing that all the time, I think it's going to lead to long-term problems. And that's just like sparring, but then you also have the volume of all your training. And if you're training so hard and you're sparring so much and you're not getting enough technical training, um, yeah, I think a lot of times guys will kind of fall on one side or the other, and kind of miss the where they should be in the middle, right? They can do too much technical training and not enough hard grappling or hard sparring, or they can just fall in, the majority of their training is sparring, grappling, and lifting weights, or strength and conditioning, where everything's just so hard on your body. I mean, that will wear you out, and that will make your career short, and that'll give you a lot of injuries and all kinds of stuff, overtraining. But and on the other side, I think it's, if I had to pick one, I'd probably pick the technical side, because you're going to go longer, and you're going to, like I said, you're going to get more years out of your fight career. But yeah, I mean, even just like I said, the techniques that I learned, as I've gotten older and seen more and more, I kind of realized, wow, I learned all these high level techniques that are effective at the highest level of competition, whether it's wrestling, jiu-jitsu, boxing. I learned a lot of this stuff early on, or I learned it, you know, in my early fighting career, where now I see it and it's like, I see guys training a different way and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't use that move because I think it works for kids, but once they get older, they're going to have to throw it out. So let's work on something else. I don't know. Like I, yeah, I don't have a great answer maybe, but I do believe just the understanding of the sport that God gave me is a big part of it, as well as just his favor and protection.
Absolutely. That's a great answer to it, man. I love that because, well, first of all, a few of the physical things you said there with looking after your health, looking after your longevity, building, understanding your layers. Obviously, all of that is fantastic. The compassionate approach to not doing people unnecessary damage and everything. There's a lot of things you said there, but also, I'm glad we got to touch on that because credit where credit is due, as you mentioned, with God giving you the favors, giving you the understanding, opening the doors. Personally, I mean, I believe you still have to obviously walk through those doors, you still have to follow that path, you still have to be
Mhm.
committed to it, and you still have to put the work into to sort of maximize what he's given you, if that makes sense, from the way I see it. So that was the reason for this when I sort of honed in on you personally, because there's the strength that he's giving you, and then there's you choosing to sort of pick that up and carry forward with it. So absolutely fantastic. So the last couple of things, because I
That's
am,
right. I was gonna, do you mind if I add one more thing? Because even like you're saying, being diligent and being consistent, I think is huge for any sport, for life, right? But again, it's something God gave. My dad taught me that, and I've seen, both sides of people who've grown up without that discipline. So with all the faults my dad had, he taught me discipline. That's so important in life. Um, and yeah, I just think it's so important. I mean, sometimes I can be, my wife will accuse me of being hard on the kids because I'm, I discipline them, and what I mean by that is like, I make them very structured in certain things and I make them work very hard, and I don't accept, um, 90%. I expect them to do a good job. I expect it perfect, things like that. And, but what I really want is for them to understand that mindset of being consistent, working hard, doing your best every time. And it doesn't matter what it is, because once you have that and you apply that to what you want or what God's calling you to, then you'll be successful. And yeah, so sorry, I just thought I would interject that too, because even that, it's like something God gave me.
Mhm. Absolutely, but that's what I was saying in a nutshell, really,
Hmm.
what you said there. So, absolutely. And funnily enough, because we've talked about your future plans at the beginning, I was going to give a very brief mention to that of if you don't mind me asking this one, are your children going to follow in your footsteps as a fighter? Obviously, they're following in your footsteps with life. But do they compete like wrestle or do anything in sports like that, if you don't mind me asking about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have four girls and one boy. And so all of my kids do or have done martial arts. Like currently, I have four little ones from ages 6 to 12 that live here in Florida, and so my boy wrestles 5 days a week, and I teach all the kids jujitsu and karate, um, on a consistent basis. And I don't. I mean, for the longest time, I didn't want any of my kids to fight, but I did want them. I understood benefits of martial arts and wrestling or jiu-jitsu or whatever for self-defense, and for all those same kind of things of, you know, being disciplined and learning how to persevere through tough things. But you know, my boy, who is 11 years old, he's recently kind of shown interest, like that, you know, that's something he wants to do. Especially once I started picking up karate lessons with him, he really likes that stuff. And always loved wrestling, and he always said before that he didn't want to fight, and now that's changed. So but I'm at a point where I see the where God can use that. So at first I didn't want him to do that. I just want him to be like a minister, you know, like go preach the gospel somewhere, do something meaningful. But now I have a different view of it. And, you know, part of that was from my trip to Armenia, where this young guy started this gym as a ministry, just off of God's calling, and seeing what God's done with that, how many people he's able to influence and help, and really he's able to be a father to kids who don't have a father, don't have a good father, don't have a good family life. And so, I mean, if that's the path God has for my little Nate, then, you know, I'm all for it. And I want the best for him. My girls, I want them to know martial arts for self-defense and just physical strength. But all my girls do gymnastics and dance essentially. So hopefully they go more towards that way, because I definitely 100% don't want any of my girls fighting.
Absolutely. Well, it's one way or another, it's amazing how you are instilling these valuable life lessons into them. And I always say that martial arts and practicing that type of thing, it improves people as people, whether they follow into it as a sort of a professional career or not. You know, even just practicing it, there's a lot to gain there. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as well, pretty much the final thing, because we've talked about a lot. And even though today it's been an overview of your life and your faith and certain key moments in your career, and I always sometimes, with people who've done as much as you have, I always feel there's other things we can hone in on. But I'm happy because we've ticked the boxes I was aiming for, with, you know, some motivation, some inspiration, some hope and things. And obviously people love to hear about your fights. There's been some great fun stories in there. And I'm sure we've only scratched the surface with that, but nonetheless, I hope that today we've got into a little bit about who you are as a person, not just who you are as a fighter, if that makes sense, and maybe share that a little bit more. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out of your day and being an open book, is the best way I can think of to sort of say it, in terms of sharing so many things from your heart. And I know you are an open person, but I sometimes say to people, I appreciate that in an interview, because it's, you know, speaking from the heart is what makes everything possible that we've done today. So thank you very much. I'd like to say God bless to you and your family. I hope you have a great day. You've got more of it to go than I have. And I'm excited to get this interview out there and show the world, you know, this aspect of your story. I won't say your story in total, but certainly this aspect of your story. I'm excited for that. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Liam. God bless you too, brother.
Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the Simply Inspired YouTube channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon.